What motivates people to stalk?
They come from different angles, I'm afraid. There are different reasons why people would start to stalk. It can be, obviously, somebody who's disordered. It could be someone who was perhaps a resentful type person who wants somebody to blame for things. And basically, they've chosen you as the victim of stalking. Such individuals can unleash quite a bit of kind of violence and fear. However, the most common reason for stalking is the perpetuation of basically a failed relationship. And often these relationships have failed from day one because the individual concerned is very controlling, someone who actually doesn't so much have a passion for the individual, but actually just wants to be able to control them, make them do what they want them to do, and remain, as it were, their property. And this is the most common form of stalking, and it's the one where you have the most violence, and often you have, unfortunately, deaths.
So psychologically, it seems to be a bit about control, or rather a lot about control. But where does that stem from? Is that a nature or a nurture thing? Are people born psychologically damaged in that regard, I suppose? Or is that like a very early years thing?
It's something that you can be born with a predisposition to. These individuals have, if you like, a slight brain difference, let's say difference. And as they grow up, they kind of use this, or they kind of work against it, or they try and struggle with it. And it basically emanates into what we call a personality disorder. This would actually be labeled kind of borderline, psychopathic. Basically, people who struggle to have a normal relationship with other people without utilizing some form of threat, some form of control, way beyond that which you would find in an average normal person who has a successful relationship. These individuals aren't just simply people that fail at relationships. These are people who can destroy relationships, and often will pick a victim who is a nice, nurturing, pleasant individual who could and probably should have a very, very pleasant relationship with their chosen partner.
And when it crosses over, as it all too often very unfortunately does, into murder, right? What's the switch that goes off there? Because that, to me anyway, seems like an absolutely massive leap. The idea that you might stalk someone, you might obsessively message someone, you might follow them wherever they go, but then deciding to actually commit murder, that seems like a huge step forward.
It is, and it kind of gives you an idea of the actual fact that they are not really pursuing a normal relationship, because you wouldn't want someone who was dead, would you, really? It doesn't really fulfill the criteria for having a successful relationship. No, it's all about control in this particular instance, and sometimes revengeance and I will show you, basically, is the element that comes to the fore at that point. The behaviour becomes increasingly cold, it becomes increasingly planned, and it becomes increasingly distanced from the actual feelings of that person who is being pursued. They will be pursued in all sorts of ways, and they will be terrorised. It's what you call psychological terrorism. And to be honest, many victims would actually prefer to be assaulted, beaten senseless, rather than suffer years and years of this kind of horrific attrition of their lives. Because being under that kind of pressure really is a kind of death sentence in itself.
Well, just focusing in a bit on Gracie's Law, what it really kind of wants to do is give police more resources to help deal with things like stalking. I imagine that stalking and investigating a stalking case is quite a labour-intensive and resource-intensive job for the police, and clearly resources and labour numbers are not particularly high for the police at the moment. Do you think the police are able to stop it? Do you almost need a psychologist to see it? I mean, it's a very difficult thing, I would imagine, even with resources and manpower, for police to always get right, isn't it?
I would imagine it would be almost impossible to have sufficient resources to compensate for the police not really fully understanding what they're dealing with. We have had many, many attempts to inform the police. A colleague of mine, Hamish Brown, he produced a leaflet for the police to educate them on this many years ago. And we still arrive at this day when police sometimes bungle these cases, sometimes do not recognise the truth in what the victim is telling them, because it's often contradicted by a very confident, very kind of sane-looking perpetrator, whereas the victim, as you might imagine, becomes hysterical and doesn't sound very believable. Unfortunately, police fall into the trap of thinking that it just is someone who is kind of making half of this up, and it makes for a very difficult judgment on the side of the police to actually come forward and take it very, very seriously and follow the procedure that has been given to them over and over again. Unfortunately, where the resources probably are needed is actually making sure that every police officer in this country is aware, trained in, and has a good understanding of the dynamics of stalking and the actual problems of the victim and how they express themselves, so that they can recognise it rapidly and do the most important thing is to prevent it progressing to murder.
How many of these people are there out there? Are there actually loads of people who have the inclination to be stalkers, who could indeed be murderers, who have this kind of psychological issue, who manage somehow to keep it in check? Are these numbers growing?
To say whether the numbers are growing is difficult, because we do kind of catch more and more of them progressively as we become more aware and this kind of process of educating the police improves. But there are many, many people out there with the proclivities, with those psychological characteristics that could lead to stalking, who don't actually do it. It's kind of like what holds them back is the reality of the situation they're in. They don't particularly want to rock the boat in the relationships, who will give ground and they will, behave more and more as a normal person should. However, there are people who are out there and in great numbers, unfortunately, who will repeatedly do this. They may be involved in domestic violence, they may be involved in stalking, but it's often the same controlling behaviours that actually do lead to both outcomes. It isn't that uncommon. It's common if you want to count the number of victims. At some point in their lives, females, let's say 75% of them, that's of all females, will have encountered some form of stalking, controlling behaviour.
Yeah, absolutely. Are they? Do they tend to be very intelligent, these people? Do they tend to have an above average IQ, or is that not quite this kind of person?
I wouldn't like to say they were super intelligent, but they are more intelligent than your average criminal. They're more tenacious than the average criminal, and they are much quicker to hide their behaviours, and they're more aware of what they're doing wrong and being able to cover it up than your average criminal. And they will often try and accuse their victims of stalking them, believe it or not. And they will accuse their victims of harassing them, of impeding them, and you cite every kind of contact as being a result of the victim's behaviour. And there's quite a number of stalkers that do this, unfortunately, which adds a layer of intense distress onto the victim.
Dr. David, thank you very, very much. I know it's quite a strange subject matter, it's quite a dark subject matter, but I think it's very, very important, to be honest with you, because like I said at the start, if we don't understand this kind of behaviour, if we don't get to understand it, then it's impossible to combat it.